In today's video, we're going to be discussing the question of how somebody should go about bracketing off a material they don't particularly find useful to them in an earlier tradition, or some people call cherry picking. How can we do that? Is it a useful process? Is it something that's really good to do, or are there problems involved in it? We'll discuss all of this coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell if you want to receive notifications when I release new videos. Now, before I get to the meat of today's discussion video, I want to mention that I have a new course up over on the Online Dharma Institute, which is called Work, Money, and Pleasure, the Buddha's Teaching to Lay People. And in this course, I'm going to go through some of these early texts where the Buddha discusses how lay people can best live their lives skillfully, how they can best deal with work issues, pick the right kind of work, how they can have the right kind of mindset around work, how they can deal with their money and finances properly, and also how they can pursue pleasure in a way that's not harmful, that's good both for themselves and the people around them. And these are texts, these are suttas and teachings that are often overlooked nowadays because we tend to sort of focus on the ones that are involved more with, let's say, deep meditation, the things that we do during practice where we sit down and do something, then we think about what the Buddha taught. But there's a lot of things in these early teachings that are really quite general about how we can live our lives better and wiser. And so if you're interested in that, check out the link. I've got it down below in the show notes. And while you're over at onlinedharma.org, you can check out some of the other courses I have up there because they might be interesting to you as well. So Margaret Langston has asked a question about how this bracketing off might work, in particular for a secular practitioner such as myself, where I say that we, in a secular approach to Buddhism, we tend to leave aside or bracket off parts of the early Buddhism that we find more speculative, that aren't so useful to us nowadays, such as issues around rebirth, let's say. And I think one of the responses is to say that it would be a mistake to believe that this kind of process of bracketing off or cherry picking is somehow original or new or modern, or that it's somehow sinister or problematic. In fact, this kind of process of bracketing off is something that all of us do to some extent or other, except perhaps for that very small group of people who are literalist, fundamentalist practitioners of their particular belief system. And I'm going to get to that in a moment, but that group of literalist fundamentalists is, I think, very small in the scheme of things. The rest of us in general tend to approach belief and practice, I think, generally speaking, through a process of bracketing off parts or cherry-picking parts. So to take two very small recent examples, if you go into philosophy schools or courses, you will find people who call themselves Aristotelians. Lots of people are big into Aristotle and enjoy his teachings and consider themselves Aristotelians. But nobody accepts, for instance, Aristotle's views about momentum, because Aristotle's views on momentum are clearly false, shown false for centuries. So as a result, people who consider themselves Aristotelians, they just don't accept everything he wrote, they just accept what they think of as his most important things, in particular his ethics, let's say. Or there's also a modern movement towards Stoicism in the West. People like Massimo Pigliucci, I have a video about his book on Stoicism. He calls himself a neo-Stoic. And what it is involved in being a neo-Stoic is that you bracket off those parts of early Stoicism that you think just aren't useful to us nowadays, or at least useful to him, to people who practice this way. In particular, early Stoicism's views on God, or on some kind of divine principle, or on a teleological kind of vision about the universe. In early Stoicism, there's this kind of notion that the universe is heading in a good direction, And in order to practice right, we sort of have to get on that train in the way that the universe is progressing towards the future, in a sort of a progression upwards. And Neo-Stoics don't accept that. So again, another example where people will look to the past, accept the past, call themselves Neo-Stoics, but bracket off parts of the early tradition that they find less useful to them nowadays. Now, some people will say that the examples I've given of Aristotelianism and Stoicism are all well and good, but these don't involve religions. And when we come to a religion, such as, let's say, Buddhism, that there's more of an issue with bracketing off, with not being willing to accept something in a living tradition, let's say. But what I think has to be emphasized is that in order to be it's very difficult to be a literalist fundamentalist about a religion. In particular, it involves an enormous amount of research and study, and very few people are willing to put that kind of effort into it. You have to really be a scholar about the early material in whatever your chosen religion might be, let's say, if you're talking about religions, in order to really pursue this kind of path where you're going to say, I'm going to accept just what the early teachings say and nothing else. I'm going to be a traditionalist, literalist about this. Not to say there's anything wrong with that. I mean, and we'll repeat this several times. Some people will decide that's the way they want to do things. But what I want to emphasize is this is not an easy road. This is not a road that most people will follow. And so insofar as people are saying that most people are traditionalists, they don't mean traditionalist literalists, because there's very few of those. And to take, I think, perhaps the most salient example, we'll look at early Christianity, for example. So many people consider themselves or call themselves literalist Christians. They're literalists, let's say, about the Bible. But if we look at, in particular, let's say, the Old Testament, if we're coming from a Christian point of view, the Old Testament, it's said in the Old Testament that if you work on the Sabbath, which is Saturday, not Sunday, if you work on the Sabbath, which is Saturday, you should be killed. That is, it's a death penalty for working on a Saturday. Similarly, it's a death penalty for adultery, and it's also a death penalty for insulting your parents. Similarly, it's said that it is against the law of God to wear a clothing that is made of both wool and linen at the same time. It's also an offense to cut your hair and beard, or to shave your hair, shave your head. These are offenses. Or to construct likenesses of anything. All of these are enjoined. They're said that there's a divine law against doing any of these things in the Old Testament, and many other things besides. I've just picked a few out of here, more or less, out of the Old Testament, more or less at random. And Jesus in Matthew 5:18-20 says quite clearly that we should keep the entirety of the Jewish law. That is, that his proclamation to us as a religious teacher, Jesus' proclamation, is that all of the Jewish law is to be kept until the end of time, basically. And that if we don't keep the Jewish law, that we are not doing things properly. So to that extent, insofar as we're Christians following what Jesus had to say in Matthew, we're going to say that you have to be able to keep these laws. These laws are the law. Now, that said, virtually no Christians accept the argument that I've just given. Virtually no Christians say that we have to accept all the Jewish law. They will take other texts from the New Testament, which seem to claim that the Jewish law has been sort of left behind. That, in fact, Jesus himself seems to have done some of this by saying that, basically all of the Jewish law is to be nice to one another, to treat your neighbor as yourself, to behave kindly in the world, and that's sufficient. But elsewhere, that is to say, as I've just pointed out in Matthew, he says something quite different. So this argument by contemporary Christians that the Jewish law does not have to be taken seriously is an example that we might call a bracketing off or cherry picking. That we're bracketing off that early material in what's called the Old Testament by Christians, that we're going to bracket that off, that it doesn't speak to us because Jesus has said we don't have to deal with that. Jesus himself was Jewish. He was himself a Jewish prophet during his lifetime. So we could also make the argument just as well that Jesus himself was bracketing that material off, was saying, really all you need to do is be kind to your neighbor. You don't have to accept the entirety of the Jewish law. Although, as I've just argued, he also said you should keep the entirety of the Jewish law. So all of these involve issues of interpretation, of what we should take seriously and what we should bracket off in a tradition. And these, we might call them interpretive moves within a religious tradition, are absolutely critical to theology, to contemporary theology, to theology throughout history. How we interpret the text that we have available to us. It's called, in theology, but in all of religious studies, or really all of studies, it's called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the study around these interpretations, how we reframe earlier texts, how we decide which texts are to be taken literally, and which texts are to be taken only metaphorically. So, for example, we can either take literally what Jesus said in Matthew, in which case we're going to say you have to keep the entirety of the Jewish law, including perhaps things such as killing people for working on a Saturday, or we can take them as simply metaphorical, that is to say the Jewish law is sort of metaphorically true as just to treat your neighbor as yourself, which indeed is part of the law, but hardly the entirety of it, but to take the rest of it as metaphorically true through that interpretation. And indeed, liberal Christians nowadays typically take much of that early material as metaphorical in just this way. They'll take not only the material from the Old Testament, but even much of the material from the New Testament as metaphorical about their lives. They may even take the stories of Jesus' resurrection as metaphorical in some sense. Issues about our sinful nature as metaphorical in some sense. Also, similarly, to turn to a different religion, in Judaism, Reform Jews are people who also will take the material from the Jewish Bible, which the Christians called the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, as metaphorical. That is, it's not to be taken literally true, it's to be taken as stories that inform our lives in various metaphorical ways. Even to the extent that many Reformed Jews are themselves atheist, which is really quite different from the message you get from the Jewish Bible, for example. Now, turning from Christianity and Judaism back to Buddhism, the Buddha obviously was much more, I would say, pragmatic and down-to-earth about his ethical principles. They weren't quite as extensive and problematic as the ethical principles I've just mentioned from the Old Testament, from the Jewish Bible. Nevertheless, there are many practicing, even traditional Buddhists nowadays, who do things that literally violate the word of what the Buddha said, such things as, let's say, drinking alcohol, which I admit myself to doing, having a glass of wine with dinner. But many people do that, even traditional people. Also, we know many traditional monastics do things which also violate the letter of the rules in the Buddha's day, such as, again, drinking alcohol. There even are zendos that make alcohol, at least have been in the past. I don't know if there are still now, but that make sake, for example. They brew sake. There are monastics who get married, as we know in Zen, for example. There are monastics within certain Vajrayana traditions that pursue, again, things that the Buddha would not have considered right for a monastic to do. At least metaphorically, but even then, it's problematic from the early texts. There also were a number of doctrinal innovations in the Abhidhamma or Abhidharma, which is a later development within Buddhism, which we'll get to in a moment, that again take us out of the realm of what the Buddha originally taught and into something slightly different. And I think in a more important vein, in early Buddhism we find the real subjugation of women, even within the early Sangha. I mean, and I should say even particularly within the early Sangha. And many people will make the claim, which is true, that the Buddha seems to have treated women better than they were treated in other places, and so for that should be at least somewhat celebrated. He seems to have been ahead of his time. Nevertheless, there's no question that if you look at the early texts literally, you're going to find a somewhat particularly male-dominated kind of culture, male-centric culture, androcentric culture, And I did a video on women in Buddhism I'll put a link to up here in case you want to hear more. And many people nowadays, of course, will bracket that off, will cherry pick other things from the early Buddhist tradition and leave that one aside. Now, I think it's easier to be a literalist Buddhist, early Buddhist, let's say, than a literalist Christian. Because being a literalist Christian, as we've just said, you end up believing all kinds of things that are really problematic in today's society. Being a literalist Buddhist, that's less true. On the other hand, in order to be a literalist Buddhist, you really have to be a deep scholar of this early material. And so people who are dedicated to that process, like Bhante Sujato, for example, over on Sutta Central, really do have to become scholars, not only of the Pali material, which is where a lot of this stuff resides in the language of Pali, but also experts in Chinese and other related Indic languages where we have fragmentary material to find out what early Buddhism really said, because really, I think, arguably at this point, we still don't have a very clear idea of what early Buddhism might have been like. We're sort of seeing through the clouds, but we still have a lot of work to do. And so anybody who is dedicated to that kind of process is going to have to be a scholar of a very high order, I think, even to begin the process, because otherwise you're just not going to know what to do. Now, I can hear many of you saying, well, yes, but many literalists aren't going to be literalists about early Buddhism, because as I've just said, that we don't really exactly know what that was. Many people who call themselves literalists or consider themselves literalists, literalist Buddhists, are literalists about the tradition. In other words, they're following the literal tradition. And that's fine, once again, people can do that. But you have to be aware that then what you're doing is relying on the tradition to do the cherry picking or the bracketing off for you. In other words, when you decide to hitch your horse to a tradition, you're hitching your horse to a bunch of people who have already done a lot of that bracketing off many, many centuries ago. They've decided already which texts to take as metaphorical, which texts to take as literal. So a good example of this would be in traditional Theravada Buddhism, where the Abhidhamma is seen as the true flourishing, the true flowering of the Buddha's teaching. That is, that the sutta material is seen as being interpreted by the Abhidhamma. It's seen as being less clear than the Abhidhamma. And so whenever you have a question in the suttas about what really to believe, you go to the Abhidhamma to tell you the answer. And indeed, when you look at that Abhidhamma, you find a number of innovations, things that didn't exist in the suttas. Examples such as the doctrine of momentariness. That is, that there are a certain number of discrete moments within time. And in particular, mind events come in discrete moments. So there are a certain number of moments in each mind event. Or I should say in each mental process. And we have to think of the world as sort of broken up into these mind moments. Another example is what's called the bhavanga mind, or this kind of original mind that persists underneath when there aren't any active processes occurring in the mind, and that this kind of original mind within us is something that persists from the last moment of our previous lifetime. This is once again something we don't find in the early texts. And I did an earlier video on this, which I'll put up here on the screen in case you're interested in seeing that. Now, another example is this notion, which is related to mind moments, that mindfulness, the state of being in a mindful state, is a completely pure state. And so it can't coexist with any, shall we say, hindrance states. And so when we are in a mindful state but aware of a hindrance, for example, there has to be a succession of mind moments, one after the other, where one mind moment is pure and then the next mind moment is impure and then pure and then impure. That's how it happens, rather than that we have a state where both purity and impurity are residing in the mind at the same time, as it was described in the early texts. In other words, in the early texts, we don't have this mind moment idea. That came up later. And that is an interpretation of the early texts. That is a way of taking the early texts as metaphorical, but taking the Abhidhamma as literal. It's another way of, let's say, interpreting, or let's say bracketing off, cherry-picking the early material to say what you want it to, because it doesn't quite say what you want it to, so you're giving an interpretation, so that we have to say the way the Buddha put it in the suttas was metaphorical. So this is one way of interpreting the early texts, that is, using the material of the Abhidhamma, which is clearly later. It was not mentioned in either the Buddha's lifetime or in the first council. So the Abhidhamma is clearly a later material that arose after the Buddha's death, but using that material to interpret early Buddhism. And in that way, cherry picking, in that way, changing it slightly. But in the same way we can do that, we can also use other criteria to interpret those early texts. So for example, one criterion, a different criterion we might use to interpret the early texts is one that I think was expressed extremely well by Bhikkhu Bodhi, who is a traditional monastic and indeed one of the foremost traditional monastics in the tradition right now. And Bhikkhu Bodhi says, "The supreme goal of Buddhism is the liberation of mind by non-clinging." And if Bhikkhu Bodhi is indeed right about this, and I think he is, that the supreme goal of Buddhism is the liberation of mind by non-clinging, if he's right about that, then we can indeed relax around these more speculative aspects of the early tradition, such as belief in rebirth, belief in truly active karma that acts into the next lifetime, and so on. We can set those aside, issues of extrasensory perception and sort of magical abilities that come with jhana, let's say, for example. Now, because if the point is a liberation of mind by non-clinging, then the Buddhist practice is much more down-to-earth and pragmatic. And indeed, I think Bhikkhu Bodhi clearly got his formulation from the Four Noble Truths, because the liberation of mind, that is the third noble truth, that there is liberation, comes about by overcoming the problems in the second noble truth, that is clinging. And so if we can liberate the mind through non-clinging, we can do that through a universal kind of non-clinging to all kinds of things, including clinging to views. Clinging to views as mine, as something that I possess. And so if that is the interpretive strategy that we use, the hermeneutic strategy that we use to look at the early texts and say that really the point of early Buddhism is the liberation of mind by non-clinging, then it doesn't really matter so much whether we accept rebirth, so long as, for example, we are ethical people, we behave ethically, we're not harming people, we certainly behave as ethically as any traditional believer would, then there's less, I think, of an issue. Now, to get back to Margaret Langston's exact question, she was asking how we do this, how we go about bracketing off parts of a tradition. And the only way that I know how to do it is to bring the tradition into conversation with our contemporary worldview. We bring it into conversation, and we decide, based on our contemporary worldview, what parts of the traditional belief and practice we find most useful, and what parts we find less appropriate to us nowadays, for example. One example being, let's say, the treatment of women. We look at that early tradition, we find the treatment of women is not really optimal, to say the least. That bhikkhunis, that nuns were treated very much as second-class citizens within this early Sangha, and that as we come to a Buddhist belief and practice nowadays, that's something we can perhaps bracket off. And so that is the general process that any of us use, and indeed that is the process that has been used throughout history. In other words, it would be a mistake to think that this is something that just happens now in the 21st or 20th century. It's something that always happens. It happens in every culture. So when Buddhism went into China, then the Chinese people who accepted Buddhism did the same. They modified things slightly. They accepted certain parts more than others. Similarly in Japan, similarly in Korea, similarly in Southeast Asia. And so we find many indigenous beliefs being melded with Buddhism locally that become the Buddhism of that place. And some of these may not be doctrinally correct in certain respects, and if we look at any kind of a anthropological study of the way Buddhism is practiced around the world, we're going to find this. It certainly is true in Southeast Asia and indeed all parts of the world. And I'm just talking about Buddhism now, it's true in Christianity, it's true in every religion. So this is nothing new, and it's nothing that is problematic in that sense. That is to say, it always happens. It's not something that we can, as the Buddha said himself, all things change. And so the question is how to keep them change, how to keep whatever tradition you're interested changing in a skillful direction, in a way that makes it approachable to more people while retaining what is best about the tradition, what is most ethical, what is best, what is most helpful to people. Now, once again, to repeat, if you yourself are a traditional believer, either believe and accept the tradition of a particular country, or who want to persist in believing the tradition of early Buddhism, that's fine. No skin off my nose. You practice how you wish. But just be aware of the historical element in all of this. That if you want to go back to that earliest tradition, you're going to have to be a scholar. And that indeed, in a way, the Buddha himself was picking and choosing from the traditions around him. That is to say, picking elements of Jainism, picking elements of Vedic Brahmanism to accept, such as their dislike of sense pleasures, let's say, their acceptance of certain forms of meditation, while rejecting other parts of their belief system, such as, let's say, the caste system in Vedic Brahmanism. So all of us do this, including the Buddha, including Jesus in Christianity. So if you find this talk and this process useful, check out my Patreon page. It's linked here down below. Check out the new course I have up on the Online Dharma Institute at onlinedharma.org. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and I hope I'll catch you on the next one of these videos. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.